Hi guys, this is Mr. Evans. Today we're going to be looking at William Blake's poem London. We're going to be reading and analysing his poem, and specifically we're going to be looking for details that help us understand the poem London. So firstly, it's important when looking at contextual information such as the historical background of the writer that this relates to the specific work we're looking at. So let's start with some important facts about William Blake. So Blake was born in 1757 in London, where he actually lived for almost his entire life. Now this is important because when looking at the text itself, it gives us the strong impression that the I in the poem, walking through the streets of London, it reads, "I wander through each chartered street," is actually Blake himself writing from his own experience. So Blake was a poet, a painter and a printmaker. He had an interesting relationship with religion. He respected the Bible. He thought of himself as a Christian, but he disliked organized religion and the church. From his perspective, there was an inherent distrust toward them, which really does inform and tell us a little bit more about the poem itself. So guys, now we're going to look at some of the historical context of which the poem was set within, namely the Industrial Revolution. Now it's important to note that you will be set research tasks where you'll collect your own information on the Industrial Revolution. This will be set toward the end of the lesson and uploaded at class charts at a later date. So, the Industrial Revolution. It was a massive social shift from the way life had been for many, many hundreds of years. A shift that involved moving toward a mechanized production market. This basically meant that large areas of agriculture, such as farmland and farming areas, were shifting to a more technological means of production. So essentially, this meant a change from farmed land into factories and foundries that would become the Industrial Revolution. Specifically, London was one of the first areas to swallow up this farmland, producing large and vast amounts of material and goods like never seen before. So for your starter, we're going to be looking at these images from London, quite old images as well, and specifically I want you to think about what the individuals in the images might be feeling or thinking or going through. I'd like to write down 5 adjectives. You've got 5 minutes to have a look at the images and get down your thoughts. Well done. Make sure you've got those words at the top of your page. Now, before we start to analyse the poem in depth and read through it, we're going to have a quick look at the structure of the poem. Now, as you can see, the poem itself is split into 4 quatrains. Now, these will look to you as if they are paragraphs. Now, briefly, let's just have a quick look at the general themes and ideas within the poem. So, we know and we've already spoken about the fact that William Blake is writing from personal experience. He sees sadness and despair everywhere. And we know the speaker, which is, of course, William Blake, wanders through the streets of London and comments on what he sees. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. So throughout the poem, we're continuously confronted with this idea of overwhelmingly negative language, and it's important to note the reasons for Blake using this language. So if we analyse the word marks, now, in of itself, the word marks is obviously related to the marks that can be given or dished out. Now, it's relevant because we are looking about the exploitation of people en masse. And Blake's vision was this sense that people were being exploited. So the operative question here is not just what's happening to mark people, but who is marking them. And who is marking them are those who are in power. So when looking at the first quatrain, our first person speaker is telling us basically, I walk through the streets of London near the River Thames, and in the faces that everybody that I meet, I see signs of weakness and signs of unhappiness. So that's just a basic translation, but one of our first jobs is to start to look at language. When reading this poem for the first time, you become instantly drawn to the imagery of suffering. And I've highlighted some of that here. You can see that highlighted in red. And that's crucial because much of the poem does present suffering, or we could even call it conflict. So I want us to look at the first line of this quatrain. Now, it's important because not only does it present to us Blake's first initiation into London itself, but it shows us a few key and telling things. A word that I want to be drawn to first is the word chartered. Now, this may be a word that you haven't heard before. However, it does relate quite closely to the themes of the poem. Now, for those of you who don't know, the word chartered simply means privately owned. So a chartered street, for example, would be something whereby it would be owned by individuals, whether that be through shops or private lettings or through the buildings themselves. Now, chartered is something that was very much given among the time of William Blake. Now, he would have known that word, he would have known what it meant, also the individuals and who'd own things around him. So let's move on now to the second line underneath where it says, near where the chartered Thames does flow. Now, the Thames is, as we know, a river within London, and river, as we know as well, does flow. So a flowing river tells to us and shows us that effectively river should be a free-flowing thing. However, the idea of chartered alters the interpretation of that slightly because obviously, as we now know, chartered means privately owned. So if a street can be privately owned, then a river can also. And it also changes this essence of what a river should probably be. So Blake's whole idea is based around this almost distortion of normality, this sense of people being taken, ripped from the social norms that they lived within, and given this sense of ownership. And you could call this, in its very essence, a dominance over themselves. Okay, guys, so well done for your focus so far. You've done really well. There's a lot to talk about, and there's a lot of themes to discover. However, I want you to do a short task for me now. What I'd like for you to do is to look at these two words in the last line of this quatrain, weakness and woe. I want you to write down what it is that they show us and also how they make the reader feel. So guys, as we talked about previously, much of the poem presents the suffering and plights of those who live within London. And I'm going to skip ahead slightly and just begin to look at the poem as a whole with you. And what I want us to do together is to begin to highlight any negative language. And as you can see, I've already started by highlighting that negative language in red. Now this becomes an overwhelmingly long list of negative words, which you could analyse one by one or cumulatively. This could show how the suffering is so overwhelmingly extensive that it stretches out to everyone. Now, looking at the language that I've picked out marks of weakness, marks of woe, every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, the mind-forged manacles, chimney sweeper's cry, soldier's sigh, and so forth. So as you can see, this negative language does extend and almost create a pattern for us to look at and see. So guys, alongside your main task, I've also set you up a challenge box that you can see in purple. Now this is going to be an important factor for you looking at the poem as a whole, because it does present a really interesting idea. Now looking at the line, the mind-forged manacles, we can start to glean from this what Blake was trying to attempt to do. Now, this idea of being mind-forged. Now, what Blake was effectively trying to say that was many of the problems that people were suffering from within London at the time were mind-forged. This means almost a form of self-creation from them. So mind-forged means that their problems are created in their own heads and they're forged, meaning they're melded together through this essence and idea of a manacle. Now, for those of you who don't know, I'm going to let you research what a manacle is. Well done so far, guys. I hope you've also had a chance to have a look at the extension and challenge tasks in the boxes on each slide as well. So, Moving on to our main task, what I want us to look at is creating a PQE exploring how Blake creates a sense of negativity in the city, obviously the city being that of London. Now, what I've done for you is begin to model the opening to this PQE through the point. Now, I'm just going to read this out with you, and I want you to focus on some of the key points that I bring up and how potentially you could pick quotations that fit within the point. And in addition, if you wish to create your own opening point, please do so. So, Blake demonstrates the suffering and pain of those who lived and struggle within London. This becomes an overwhelming wave of negativity that reflects the hardships faced. Now, our first task, obviously, or your first task, will be to find the appropriate quote. You'll then need to move on to your E-blue, E-red, and E-green. I'm going to leave the PQE stem sheet for those of you who would like to refresh, and I wish you all good luck on this task.